Welcome to a story that begins with a handful of horsemen on the edge of a dying world and ends with the reshaping of 3 continents. In the late 13th century, a minor chieftain's son named Osman commanded a territory so small it barely registered on any map. Yet within 2 centuries, his descendants would shatter the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire, claim the throne of Constantinople, and build a dominion stretching from the Danube to the Nile, from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf. How did a tiny frontier principality, surrounded by rivals and pressed against the borders of Christendom, become one of the longest-lasting empires in human history? How did it govern millions of Christians, Jews, and Muslims across vast distances for over 600 years? And why, when it finally collapsed, did its fall redraw the borders of the modern world in ways we are still fighting over today? This is the complete story of the Ottoman Empire, and we are going to follow every step of it. From the Turkic migrations that swept across the Central Asian steppes, through the Seljuk collapse that opened the door to Anatolia, to the moment Osman declared his independence and planted the seed of a dynasty. We will walk through the conquests of Orhan, the thunder of Murad at Kosovo, the catastrophe of Bayezid before Tamerlane, and the astonishing recovery that followed. We will stand before the walls of Constantinople on that fateful May morning in 1453 and witness the world change forever. We will explore the golden age of Suleiman, the intricate politics of the harem, the discipline of the Janissaries, the beauty of Ottoman calligraphy and tile work, and the daily rhythms of life in the Grand Bazaar. And we will follow the long, painful centuries of decline, the desperate reforms, the nationalist uprisings, the devastation of the Great War, and the final abolition of the Sultanate in 1922. This story matters because the Ottoman Empire did not simply vanish. Its legacy lives in the minarets of Istanbul, in the borders of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, in the national memories of Greece and Serbia and Bulgaria, in the very existence of modern Turkey. Every conflict in the modern Balkans and the modern Middle East carries Ottoman fingerprints. To understand our world, you must understand this empire. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of great powers, please subscribe so you never miss our next exploration. Each week, we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history. Now, let us step back to the wind-swept frontiers of Anatolia and begin this journey. Long before the crescent banner flew over palace walls, long before any sultan's name was whispered in prayer, there was grass, an ocean of it, rippling under endless sky, stretching from the borders of China to the shores of the Caspian. The Central Asian steppe was a world unto itself, and the Turkic peoples who moved across it lived by rhythms older than any written chronicle. They rode, they herded, they fought, and when the land could no longer sustain them, they moved westward. These migrations unfolded across centuries, not as a single wave, but as a slow, relentless current of clans and confederations pressing toward warmer pastures and richer trade routes. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Turkic groups had already entered the Islamic world as slave soldiers, administrators, and eventually rulers. They embraced Islam not through conquest, but through contact, absorbing the faith along the caravan roads of Transoxiana and Khorasan. Among these peoples, the Oghuz Turks would prove the most consequential for the story that follows. In the 11th century, the Seljuk clan of the Oghuz forged an empire that redrew the map of the Islamic heartland. Their ambitions turned toward Anatolia, that ancient peninsula where Greek, Roman, and Byzantine civilizations had layered themselves over millennia. In the year 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, Sultan Alp Arslan shattered the Byzantine army of Emperor Romanos IV. The defeat itself did not immediately deliver Anatolia to Turkic hands, but it broke the imperial frontier. Byzantine defenses fractured, and Turkic warriors, pastoralists, and holy men poured through the gaps. Within decades, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum took root in central Anatolia. Konya became its capital, a city adorned with carved stone portals, turquoise-tiled mosques, and caravanserais that welcomed merchants traveling between east and west. The Sultanate governed a surprisingly cosmopolitan world where Turkic nomads, Greek-speaking Christians, Armenian communities, and Persian-educated scholars coexisted under a single political canopy. Trade flourished. Architecture blossomed in geometric splendor. For nearly 2 centuries, the Sultanate of Rum stood as the dominant power of Anatolia. Then came the Mongols. In 1243, at the Battle of Kosadar, the Mongol armies crushed the Seljuk forces with devastating efficiency. The Sultanate did not vanish overnight, but its authority bled away year by year. Central power dissolved. Provincial commanders, tribal leaders, and frontier warriors carved out their own domains. Anatolia shattered into a mosaic of small principalities, each one known as a beylik. These beyliks competed fiercely for territory, followers, and legitimacy. Some hugged the Aegean coast, others controlled mountain passes or river valleys deep in the interior. Along the northwestern frontier, where Anatolia pressed against the shrinking borders of Byzantium, the conditions were uniquely volatile. Here, warriors gathered not merely for plunder, but for the prestige of holy war against a Christian empire that had once seemed invincible. Dervishes and wandering mystics blessed their campaigns. Displaced populations swelled their ranks. It was in this fractured, restless, spiritually charged borderland that the smallest and most obscure of the beyliks began to stir. Nestled in the hills near the town of Soğut, a minor chieftain's family tended flocks and raided Byzantine outposts. No chronicler of the age paid them particular attention. No court poet celebrated their name. The great powers of the region looked elsewhere, toward wealthier rivals and more immediate threats. Yet it was precisely this obscurity, this position at the empire's forgotten edge, that would prove decisive. The frontier demanded adaptability, rewarded ambition, and forgave low birth. From this shattered Anatolian world, from the wreckage of Seljuk glory and the chaos of Mongol aftermath, something new was about to emerge. His father Ertuğrul left behind little more than a name, a small territory near Soğut, and a network of alliances as fragile as mountain fog. The man who inherited this modest patrimony around 1281 was Osman, a frontier lord of no particular renown, commanding perhaps a few hundred mounted warriors and governing a population of semi-nomadic Turkmen families scattered across the hills of northwestern Anatolia. No palace awaited him, no treasury overflowed. The Byzantine fortress towns of Bilecik, Yenişehir, and Karacahisar loomed nearby, their garrisons still loyal to Constantinople, their stone walls a daily reminder that this was contested ground. Yet Osman possessed something that distinguished him from the dozens of rival beys who carved small domains across post-Seljuk Anatolia. He understood the frontier not as a barrier, but as an invitation. the Byzantine border provinces had grown weak, their military estates poorly maintained, their local commanders increasingly isolated from the imperial capital. Osman exploited every crack. His raids were not random acts of plunder, but calculated expansions, each successful strike drawing new followers to his banner. Turkmen pastoralists seeking grazing land, displaced warriors from collapsed beyliks, even disaffected Byzantine frontier soldiers and local Christians who found advantage in cooperation, all gravitated toward a leader who delivered results. The foundation myths that later Ottoman chroniclers wove around Osman reveal the dynasty's own understanding of its origins. The most famous tells of a dream in which a great tree grows from Osman's body, its branches spreading across mountains and seas, its shade covering the entire world. Whether Osman ever dreamed such a vision matters less than what the story accomplished. It transformed a pragmatic frontier chieftain into a divinely chosen sovereign, linking political ambition to spiritual destiny. Sufi dervishes and wandering holy men who populated the Anatolian frontier lent religious legitimacy to his campaigns, framing raids against Byzantine territories as acts of faith. By the late 1290s, Osman's beylik had grown powerful enough to operate independently of any Seljuk overlord. The traditional date of 1299 marks the moment Ottoman historians later identified as the formal founding, when Osman ceased acknowledging even nominal Seljuk authority. The reality was likely more gradual, a slow accumulation of autonomy rather than a single dramatic declaration. But the symbolic weight endured for centuries. Osman's military strategy centered on patience. He did not storm the great walled cities directly. Instead, he surrounded them, cutting supply lines, absorbing the countryside, winning over or intimidating local populations until the fortresses became islands in an Ottoman sea. Karakahisa fell early. Yenişehir became a base of operations, its fertile plain providing agricultural wealth to sustain a growing military household. The siege of Bursa, the great prize of Bithynia, began as a long encirclement that would stretch across years. Bursa was no minor settlement. It sat at the foot of Mount Uludağ, rich from silk production and trade, its hot springs famous since Roman times. Controlling Bursa meant controlling access to the Sea of Marmara and the lucrative routes connecting Anatolia's interior to Constantinople's markets. Osman committed his forces to its slow strangulation, tightening the noose season by season while Byzantine relief efforts faltered. He would not live to see the city gates open. In 1326, Bursa finally surrendered, but Osman lay dying or had already passed. His son Orhan entered the city as its new master, and the modest frontier beylik suddenly possessed an urban capital worthy of ambition. Osman was buried in Bursa, and for 6 centuries every new sultan would gird a sword at his tomb, binding themselves to the founder's memory. What Osman built was not yet an empire. It was something more elemental, a political culture that rewarded merit alongside lineage, absorbed outsiders willingly, and married military expansion to religious purpose. The beylik's strength lay not in rigid institutions, but in flexibility, in the ability to adapt Byzantine administrative practices, Turkic warrior traditions, and Islamic legal frameworks into a single functioning organism. From a village in the hills, from a chieftain whose name once meant nothing beyond a single valley, a dynasty had been born that would outlast every contemporary European royal house. Orhan inherited more than a beylik. he inherited momentum. Bursa, still warm from siege, became the seat of a state that would spend the next 3 decades transforming itself from a frontier raiding enterprise into something with the architecture of permanence. Where Osman had been a warrior chieftain governing through personal loyalty, Orhan became a builder of institutions, and the difference between the two men marks the difference between a tribal confederation and a nascent state. The first signs appeared in coinage. Orhan struck silver coins bearing his name and title, a declaration of sovereignty that no mere frontier lord would dare. He organized his territories into administrative districts, appointed judges trained in Islamic law, and established the first Ottoman medrese in Bursa, linking religious scholarship to political authority. The mosque complexes rising along Bursa's hillsides were not simply places of worship. They were statements of legitimacy, combining prayer halls with soup kitchens, baths, and hostels for travelers, weaving the Ottoman presence into the daily rhythm of conquered lands. His military innovations proved equally consequential. Orhan formalized the division between infantry and cavalry, creating paid standing forces alongside the traditional mounted warriors who fought for plunder and land grants. These early infantry units, drawn partly from Christian converts and prisoners, foreshadowed the Janissary Corps that would later become the empire's most feared instrument. The Timar system began taking shape, granting cavalrymen revenue from agricultural land in exchange for military service, binding the army to the soil and the soil to the state. Byzantine weakness made expansion almost gravitational. Orhan captured Nicaea in 1331 and Nicomedia in 1337, absorbing the last significant Byzantine strongholds in northwestern Anatolia. These were not obscure villages. Nicaea had hosted the ecumenical councils that defined Christian orthodoxy. Their fall signaled that Ottoman power had moved beyond raiding into permanent territorial conquest. Then came the crossing that changed everything. In 1354, a devastating earthquake shattered the fortress walls of Gallipoli on the European shore of the Dardanelles. Orhan's son Suleiman Pasha seized the moment, occupying the ruined fortifications before Byzantine forces could respond. Ottoman warriors poured across the narrow strait, and for the first time, Turkish soldiers stood on European soil, not as mercenaries or raiders, but as permanent settlers. Gallipoli became a bridgehead, and from its crumbling walls the Ottomans gazed northward into Thrace, toward the rich agricultural plains and the ancient road networks that led to the Balkans and beyond. The significance of this crossing cannot be overstated. Every European power that would later tremble before Ottoman armies, every Balkan nation whose history would be shaped by centuries of Ottoman rule, every diplomatic crisis that would consume European chancelleries for 500 years, traces its origins to this single moment. Turkish horsemen walking through earthquake rubble onto a continent that had no idea what was coming. Orhan consolidated the European foothold methodically. Turkish settlers were brought across the strait, establishing villages and garrisons. Byzantine Thrace, already weakened by civil wars and plague, offered little resistance. The Ottomans advanced not through apocalyptic conquest, but through steady absorption, offering terms to towns that surrendered, integrating local populations, maintaining existing agricultural systems while layering Ottoman administration on top. By the time Orhan died around 1362, the Beylik his father had founded was unrecognizable. It possessed a functioning bureaucracy, a legal system, a standing military, a coinage, diplomatic relations with both Byzantine and Turkic neighbors, and territory on 2 continents. The marriage alliance Orhan had forged with the Byzantine emperor, wedding the Princess Theodora, illustrated the Ottoman approach perfectly. Pragmatic, absorptive, willing to bridge cultural boundaries when power demanded it. What Orhan bequeathed to his successor Murad was no longer a frontier principality struggling for survival among rival beyliks. It was a state with European ambitions, an army capable of sustained campaigns, and an institutional framework sophisticated enough to govern diverse populations across a widening geography. The crossing at Gallipoli had opened a door that would never close. Murad inherited that open door and walked through it with an army behind him. Within 2 years of assuming power, Ottoman forces swept across Thrace with a speed that stunned the fragmented Christian kingdoms beyond. Adrianople, the great Byzantine city on the Maritsa River, fell around 1362. Murad renamed it Edirne and made it his capital, shifting the empire's center of gravity decisively westward, away from Bursa and the Anatolian heartland, toward the forests and river valleys of southeastern Europe. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer a state content with raiding. It was an empire planting itself permanently on European soil. The Balkans in the 1360s were a patchwork of feuding Serbian, Bulgarian, and Byzantine lordships, each too weak to resist alone, too proud to unite. Murad exploited this fragmentation with surgical precision. His commanders moved through Thrace, Macedonia, and into the Bulgarian lands, capturing fortress after fortress. Philippopolis fell, Ceres fell, Sofia fell in 1385. Each conquest extended a network of roads, garrisons, and administrative posts that transformed raided territory into governed provinces. It was during these decades that one of the Ottoman Empire's most distinctive and controversial institutions took shape. The Devshirme, a periodic levy of Christian boys from Balkan villages, created a pipeline of human talent converted to Islam, trained in Ottoman language and customs, and channeled into military and administrative service. The most capable became Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, loyal not to tribe or family but to the throne itself. Others rose through palace schools to become governors, viziers, and architects of imperial policy. The system was brutal in its extraction, yet it produced a governing class of extraordinary competence, bound to the Sultan by education, faith, and gratitude rather than blood. No other medieval state engineered loyalty on this scale. Murad also formalized the Taimar system, granting cavalrymen the right to collect revenue from designated lands in exchange for military service. This created a self-sustaining military economy across the expanding provinces, reducing the need for a costly standing treasury, while binding the Sipahi horsemen to the Sultan's campaigns. Together, the Devshirme and the Taimar formed the twin pillars of Ottoman imperial administration for centuries to come. By the late 1380s, the scale of Ottoman expansion had finally produced what Balkan disunity had long prevented: a coalition. Serbian Prince Lazar Rebeljanović assembled an alliance of Serbs, Bosnians, and smaller contingents, determined to halt the Ottoman advance before it consumed the last independent Christian territories in the region. The two forces met on the field of Kosovo on the 15th of June, 1389. The battle was savage and its outcome ambiguous. both armies suffered devastating losses. Prince Lazar was captured and executed, but Murad himself was killed, struck down either during or immediately after the fighting, the first Ottoman Sultan to die on a battlefield. The precise circumstances remain debated by historians, though Serbian tradition holds that a nobleman named Miloš Obilić penetrated the Ottoman lines and assassinated the Sultan in his tent. What is not ambiguous is the aftermath. Murad's son Bayezid assumed command on the field itself, reportedly ordering the execution of his brother to eliminate any succession dispute. The Ottoman army held Kosovo. Serbia became a vassal state. The coalition shattered. Within a generation, the remaining independent Balkan lordships would submit or be conquered outright. Kosovo entered Serbian memory as a sacred catastrophe, a martyrdom that defined national identity for centuries. For the Ottomans, it was something different, proof that the empire could absorb the death of its own sultan and continue advancing without pause. The institutional machinery Murad had built, the janissaries, the Taimar holders, the provincial governors, functioned beyond any single life. The state had become larger than the man who led it. Murad left behind an empire that stretched from the Anatolian interior to the Danube basin, governed by systems sophisticated enough to survive the shock of regicide on a blood-soaked field in the heart of the Balkans. Bayezid took the throne on the battlefield where his father died, and he moved as though the earth itself might cool beneath his feet if he paused. The Ottomans called him Yildirim, lightning, and the name was not flattery. It was observation. In the 13 years between Kosovo and his destruction, Bayezid waged war with a velocity that stunned allies and enemies alike, conquering faster than any Ottoman ruler before him, and very nearly faster than his empire could absorb. He turned first to Anatolia. The Turkish beyliks that had coexisted uneasily with Ottoman expansion now faced a sultan with no patience for diplomacy. Within the first years of his reign, Bayezid swallowed the emirates of Aydin, Saruhan, Germian, Menteşe, and Hamid, absorbing their territories through a combination of military force and political coercion. The Karaman Emirate, the most powerful of the Anatolian rivals, resisted longest but was crushed repeatedly. By the mid-1390s, Bayezid controlled nearly all of western and central Anatolia, a dominion his predecessors had spent decades merely nibbling at. In Europe, the pace was no less ferocious. Ottoman armies tightened their grip on Bulgaria, reducing it to a directly administered province. Wallachia was forced into vassalage. Thessaly fell. The noose around Constantinople drew tighter as Bayezid constructed the fortress of Anadoluhizara on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, a stone declaration that the ancient capital's days were numbered. A full blockade of the city began, and the Byzantine emperor desperately appealed to Western Christendom for rescue. That rescue came in 1396, and it came badly. A massive crusading army, drawn from French, Burgundian, Hungarian, and German knights, marched down the Danube to break Ottoman power in the Balkans. At Nicopolis, Bayezid met them and delivered one of the most devastating defeats in crusading history. The flower of Western chivalry was killed or captured. Ransoms enriched the Ottoman treasury. Europe recoiled in shock, and for a generation no serious crusade would be attempted again. Bayezid seemed unstoppable. He resumed the siege of Constantinople, and the city's fall appeared imminent. Ottoman governance expanded, with new administrative structures layered over conquered Anatolian lands. The Sultan held court with increasing magnificence, adopting Persian cultural forms, drinking wine openly, surrounding himself with scholars and poets. He was building not merely a state, but an imperial civilization. Yet the very speed of his conquests created a fatal vulnerability. The dispossessed Anatolian beys, stripped of their lands and titles, fled eastward, toward the court of a conqueror whose appetite for empire dwarfed even Bayezid's own. Tamerlane, lord of Samarkand, master of an empire stretching from India to the Caucasus, received these exiled princes and listened to their grievances. Diplomatic exchanges between the two rulers grew hostile. Tamerlane demanded that Bayezid restore the Anatolian beyliks. Bayezid refused with contempt. In 1402, the two greatest military powers of the Islamic world collided on the plain near Ankara. Bayezid marched his army through summer heat to meet the Timurid host, arriving exhausted and poorly supplied. The battle itself became a catastrophe when several Anatolian contingents, troops drawn from recently conquered beyliks, still loyal to their former lords, defected to Tamerlane mid-engagement. The Ottoman army disintegrated. Bayezid himself was captured, the first and only Ottoman sultan to suffer such a fate. He died in captivity within a year, broken in spirit and body. The empire shattered. Tamerlane restored the Anatolian beyliks, fragmenting the territorial unity Bayezid had built. The sultan's sons turned on each other, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling a fragment of the former domain. Suleiman held Thrace and the European provinces. Isa, Musa, and Mehmed fought across Anatolia in shifting alliances. For over a decade, the Ottoman state existed only as a collection of warring principalities, its institutions strained, its conquests reversed, its survival genuinely uncertain. The empire that had seemed destined to swallow Constantinople and dominate the eastern Mediterranean lay in pieces, and no one alive could say whether it would ever be reassembled. But it could be reassembled, and the man who did it was the youngest of Bayezid's sons. Mehmed, barely a teenager when Ankara shattered his father's empire, held only a modest portion of central Anatolia, Amasya and its surrounding highlands. He possessed no great army, no treasury, no capital. What he possessed was patience and a clarity of purpose that his brothers lacked. The Ottoman interregnum lasted from 1402 to 1413, a brutal decade in which 4 princes waged overlapping wars for supremacy. Suleiman, the eldest, controlled the wealthy European provinces from Edirne and initially seemed the likeliest victor. But his taste for luxury and his willingness to make territorial concessions to Byzantium and Venice eroded his support among frontier warriors and the military establishment. Musa, another brother, overthrew Suleiman in Rumelia in 1411, only to alienate his own allies through erratic governance. Mehmed watched, fought, retreated, fought again, and waited for his rivals to destroy themselves. By 1413, Mehmed had defeated Musa near Sofia and stood alone. He entered Edirne not as a conqueror, but as a restorer, deliberately presenting himself as the heir to Ottoman institutional continuity rather than a revolutionary. His reign, lasting until 1421, was consumed by the unglamorous but essential work of reconstruction. He suppressed the Anatolian beyliks that Tamerlane had revived, re-established central authority over provincial governors, rebuilt the Taimar system that tied military service to land revenue, and restored diplomatic relations with neighboring powers. A dangerous religious revolt led by Sheikh Bedreddin in 1416, blending social radicalism with mystical theology, threatened to fracture the empire along class and sectarian lines. Mehmed crushed it decisively, reinforcing orthodox Sunni authority as a pillar of Ottoman legitimacy. When Mehmed died in 1421, he left his son Murad II an empire that functioned again. Murad proved a worthy inheritor, though his reign was marked by relentless pressure from European coalitions alarmed by Ottoman recovery. Hungary, under capable leaders, emerged as the primary adversary. The Balkans remained contested ground, with Serbian despots and Wallachian princes shifting allegiances between cross and crescent. Murad expanded Ottoman control methodically. He besieged Constantinople in 1422, though the city's legendary walls and timely Western reinforcements forced withdrawal. He consolidated power in southern Greece, absorbed Serbian territories, and strengthened the devshirme system that fed trained Christian-born soldiers into the Janissary Corps. Twice he attempted retirement, withdrawing to Manisa to pursue contemplation, and twice crises dragged him back to the throne. The greatest of those crises came in 1444. A crusading army organized by Hungary, Poland, and the papacy marched toward the Ottoman heartland, emboldened by a treaty Murad had signed and then seen broken by his adversaries. Near the Black Sea port of Varna, on the 10th of November, the armies collided. The young Hungarian-Polish king Władysław charged directly at the Ottoman center. Janissaries surrounded him, cut him down, and mounted his head on a pike. The crusade disintegrated. Varna was not merely a battle but a verdict. Europe's last serious medieval crusading effort against the Ottomans ended in catastrophic defeat. A second victory followed at Kosovo in 1448, shattering Hungarian resistance under János Hunyadi. By the time Murad died in 1451, the empire stretched confidently across both continents, its military proven, its institutions mature, its treasury replenished. The Balkans were subdued. Anatolia was reintegrated. The Janissary Corps stood at peak discipline. The frontier had been pushed to the Danube. And Constantinople, that ancient jewel still glimmering behind its triple walls, still nominally Roman, still Christian, still unconquered, Constantinople now stood surrounded on every side by Ottoman territory. Its trade was strangled, its population dwindled, its emperors reduced to near vassalage. Murad's 19-year-old son, ascending the throne in 1451 with fierce ambition burning behind quiet eyes, looked east across the Bosphorus at those walls and saw not an obstacle but a destiny waiting to be claimed. Mehmed was 19 years old, and he had been preparing for this moment since before he understood what preparation meant. The throne came to him in February of 1451, and within weeks the young sultan's intentions became unmistakable. He ordered the construction of a massive fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point, barely half a mile from Constantinople's walls. Rumeli Hizara rose in 4 months, its towers cutting the skyline like stone teeth, choking the strait and severing the city's access to Black Sea grain shipments. The message was architectural before it was military. Through the winter of 1452, Mehmed assembled the largest siege force the Eastern Mediterranean had seen in centuries. Estimates vary, but Ottoman sources suggest 80,000 soldiers or more, supported by an enormous fleet of warships and transport vessels. Engineers cast cannons of unprecedented size at foundries in Edirne, the largest a bronze monster requiring 60 oxen and 200 men to move. Its stone projectiles weighed over half a ton. The Sultan personally supervised logistics, supply lines, road construction, and the positioning of batteries along the land walls. Constantinople's defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, supplemented by a few thousand Italian volunteers, mostly Genoese and Venetian. Emperor Constantine XI commanded a garrison stretched impossibly thin across 14 miles of fortification. The Theodosian walls, built 1,000 years earlier, remained formidable, triple-layered, fronted by a deep moat, studded with towers. But they had been designed for a garrison 10 times this size. The great chain stretched across the Golden Horn, blocked the Ottoman fleet from entering the harbour, and for a time this single defence held. The siege began in early April of 1453. Ottoman cannons pounded the walls day and night, concentrating fire on the vulnerable Mesotachion section in the Lycus Valley. The bombardment was relentless but slow. The great cannon could fire only 7 times a day, and defenders repaired breaches overnight with timber and earth. Weeks passed. Assaults were repulsed. The walls held. Then Mehmed executed the maneuver that would define his legend. Unable to breach the chain across the Golden Horn by sea, he ordered his engineers to construct a greased wooden trackway over the hills behind Galata. On the night of April 22nd, some 70 Ottoman ships were hauled overland on rollers and launched into the Golden Horn's calm waters. By dawn, the defenders woke to find enemy vessels inside their harbour. The psychological impact was devastating. The final assault came before dawn on May 29th. 3 waves struck the walls in succession. Irregular troops first to exhaust the defenders, then Anatolian regulars, then the elite Janissaries. Fighting raged for hours in near darkness. A small gate, the Kirkaporta, was found unlocked or forced open, and Ottoman soldiers poured through. Simultaneously, Janissaries breached the damaged Mesotachion section. Emperor Constantine died fighting near the walls, his body never conclusively identified. By mid-morning, Ottoman banners flew from the towers. Mehmed entered the city on horseback that afternoon. He rode directly to Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, a building that had stood for 900 years as the spiritual heart of Eastern Orthodoxy. He ordered it converted to a mosque. Prayers were offered that Friday beneath its golden mosaics, minarets would follow in the years ahead, and the building's transformation became the most potent symbol of Ottoman triumph. The city itself was given over to 3 days of controlled plunder, as was customary, but Mehmed moved quickly to restore order. He recognized that Constantinople's value lay not in its loot, but in its permanence. He repopulated the city aggressively, relocating Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities from across the empire. He confirmed the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in his office, establishing a pattern of religious governance that would endure for centuries. The city was renamed Istanbul in common usage, though official Ottoman documents would continue to use Constantinia for generations. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across Europe. Church bells rang in mourning from Rome to Moscow. Scholars fled westward carrying manuscripts that would fuel Renaissance humanism. Trade routes shifted. Diplomatic calculations across the continent were redrawn overnight. For the Islamic world, the conquest fulfilled a prophecy attributed to the Prophet himself, and Mehmed's prestige soared beyond anything military victory alone could explain. He was 21 years old, ruler of a city that had defied armies for a millennium, and he intended to make it the capital of something far greater than what he had inherited. Something far greater required something entirely new. The city Mehmed inherited in the summer of 1453 was a ghost of its former magnificence. Constantinople had been dying for decades before the siege delivered its final breath. Entire quarters lay abandoned, fields grew where neighborhoods once thrived, and the population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls, rattling inside walls built to shelter 500,000. The young sultan looked upon this emptiness not with disappointment, but with the eyes of a builder who sees possibility in ruin. The repopulation began almost immediately. Mehmed issued decrees compelling migration from across his domains. Turkish families from Anatolia, Greek communities from the Peloponnese, Armenian merchants from eastern provinces, Jewish populations welcomed from as far as Iberia, all were directed toward the city now commonly called Istanbul. Within a decade, the population surged past 100,000. Each community received its own quarter, its own places of worship, its own internal governance. The city became a mosaic of languages, faiths, and trades, bound together by imperial will. At the heart of this transformation rose Topkapi Palace, begun in 1459 on the promontory where the Golden Horn meets the Bosporus. It was not a single monumental structure, but a sprawling complex of courtyards, gardens, pavilions, and chambers, a city within a city. The outermost court handled administration and ceremony. The second court housed the imperial council, the divan, where the Grand Vizier and senior officials governed daily affairs while the Sultan listened unseen behind a latticed window. The innermost courts belonged to the Sultan's private world, the treasury, the sacred relics, and eventually the harem. Topkapi embodied Ottoman governance itself, layered, hierarchical, and deliberately opaque to outsiders. Mehmed's ambitions extended far beyond architecture. He commissioned the Kanunname, comprehensive legal codes that organized the empire's administrative, criminal, and fiscal systems alongside existing Islamic law. These codes defined the ranks of officials, regulated taxation, established punishments, and created a framework that would govern Ottoman life for generations. The Sultan positioned himself as both Islamic sovereign and heir to Roman imperial tradition, a dual identity reflected in his title. Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome. Military campaigns continued without pause. Ottoman forces swept through Serbia, completing its conquest by 1459. Bosnia fell by 1463. The Morea was absorbed. In Anatolia, Mehmed crushed the Karamanid Beylik, eliminating the last significant Turkish rival. His fleets challenged Venetian dominance in the Aegean, seizing Negroponte in 1470 and raiding the Italian coast itself. The empire's reach now stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Crimean steppe to the Mediterranean islands. The Fatih Mosque complex, completed in 1470, announced Istanbul's new identity. Built deliberately atop the ruins of the Church of the Holy Apostles, it included not merely a mosque, but a hospital, a caravansary, a library, schools, and a public kitchen feeding the poor. These Kulli complexes became the Ottoman model for urban development, religious devotion fused with social infrastructure, each foundation generating revenue through attached markets and endowments. Mehmed died in 1481, possibly poisoned, while marching eastward on yet another campaign. He was 49. In 28 years of rule following the conquest, He had transformed a war-won ruin into a functioning imperial capital, codified the legal architecture of a multi-ethnic empire, and extended Ottoman borders in every direction. The state he left behind was no longer a frontier principality grown large. It was an empire with institutions, laws, a magnificent capital, and an ideology that claimed universal sovereignty. His successors would inherit not just territory but a system, and that system, more than any single battle, was Mehmed the Conqueror's most enduring achievement. That system would be tested, bent, and ultimately redirected by a sultan who cared less for building than for cutting. Between Mehmed the Conqueror's death and the accession of his grandson's grandson, 3 decades of relative stability passed under Bayezid II, a ruler who preferred scholarship to warfare and diplomacy to conquest. But the empire Mehmed had built was a machine designed for expansion, and the men who served it grew restless under a cautious hand. Among them was Bayezid's youngest son, Selim, governor of Trabzon on the Black Sea coast, a man whose temperament earned him a name that history would never forget: Yavuz, the Grim. Selim seized the throne in 1512 through a palace coup, forcing his father's abdication and eliminating his brothers and their sons with a ruthlessness that shocked even Ottoman observers accustomed to dynastic violence. He was 42, lean and hard, with a red beard and eyes that contemporaries described as perpetually narrowed, as though measuring the distance to the next enemy. His reign would last only 8 years, yet in that compressed span he would double the empire's territory and fundamentally alter its character. The first enemy was not Christian, but Muslim. To the east, Shah Ismail of the Safavid dynasty had unified Persia under militant Shia Islam, and his missionaries were spreading their faith deep into Ottoman Anatolia. Turkmen tribes in the eastern provinces had risen in open revolt, declaring allegiance to the Safavid Shah. Selim understood this as an existential threat, a fracture running through the empire's heartland. Before marching east, he ordered a systematic campaign against Shia communities in Anatolia, a brutal suppression that eliminated potential fifth columns and announced his intentions with unmistakable clarity. In the summer of 1514, Selim led an army of perhaps 60,000 men across the high Armenian plateau toward Safavid territory. The march itself was punishing, through terrain deliberately scorched by retreating Safavid forces. At Chaldiran, east of Lake Van, the two armies met on the 23rd of August. The battle lasted a single devastating day. Ottoman artillery and disciplined Janissary musket fire shattered the Safavid cavalry charges. Shah Ismail, wounded and carried from the field, never recovered his aura of invincibility. Selim briefly occupied the Safavid capital of Tabriz, though supply difficulties forced withdrawal. The strategic result was permanent. The Ottoman-Safavid border stabilized, and Shia expansion into Anatolia was broken. But Selim's gaze had already shifted south. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz, controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and the lucrative spice trade routes. The Mamluks were militarily antiquated, still relying on mounted warriors who disdained firearms as dishonorable. In 1516, Ottoman forces poured into Syria. At Marj Dabik near Aleppo, Mamluk cavalry met Ottoman cannons, and the result was annihilation. The aged Mamluk Sultan died on the field. Within months, Selim entered Cairo, and by early 1517, the last Mamluk resistance collapsed. The conquest of Egypt transformed the Ottoman Empire from a powerful regional state into the dominant force in the Islamic world. Selim now controlled the two holy cities, the pilgrimage routes, and the revenues of Egypt's extraordinary agricultural wealth. The title of servant of the two holy sanctuaries attached itself to the Ottoman Sultan, and with it came a claim to leadership over Sunni Islam that would endure for 4 centuries. Whether Selim formally received a transfer of the caliphate from the last Abbasid figurehead in Cairo remains historically debated, but the practical reality was beyond dispute. No Muslim ruler on earth now commanded comparable resources, territory, or religious prestige. Selim died in 1520, likely from cancer, while preparing a campaign whose target remains uncertain. He was 50. In 8 years he had conquered more territory than any Ottoman sultan before him, redirected the empire's strategic orientation from Europe toward the Islamic heartlands, and given his successors a platform of wealth and legitimacy that would fuel the empire's greatest century. The son who inherited this transformed dominion was a young prince named Suleiman, and the world he received from his father's blood-stained hands was vast beyond anything Osman could have imagined. Suleiman was 25 when he ascended the throne, and unlike his father, he arrived without bloodshed. He was the sole surviving son, a rarity in Ottoman succession, and the transition was seamless. The empire he inherited stretched from the Danube to the Nile, from the Adriatic coast to the Persian frontier. No Ottoman sultan had ever begun with so much. None would use it more completely. Within a year he marched north. Belgrade, the great fortress that had resisted Mehmed the Conqueror, fell in 1521. The Hungarian buffer that had held for decades cracked open. The following year, Suleiman turned to the Mediterranean and besieged Rhodes, stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller, whose galleys had harassed Ottoman shipping for generations. After 5 months of brutal siege, the knights surrendered and departed. 2 campaigns, 2 strategic prizes, and the young sultan had announced himself to Europe with unmistakable clarity. But the blow that shattered the continental balance came at Mohacs. In 1526, on the marshy plains of southern Hungary, the Ottoman army met the forces of King Louis II. The battle lasted barely 2 hours. The Hungarian cavalry charged into Ottoman cannon fire and janissary volleys. Louis drowned fleeing the field. Hungary, one of Europe's oldest kingdoms, effectively ceased to exist as an independent state. Its territory fractured between Ottoman control, Habsburg claims, and a vassal principality in Transylvania. The geopolitical architecture of Central Europe was rewritten in a single afternoon. 3 years later, Ottoman armies stood before Vienna. The 1529 siege tested the limits of Ottoman logistics more than Austrian defenses. Suleiman had marched his forces through weeks of autumn rain, arriving late in the campaigning season with heavy artillery mired in mud far behind. The garrison held. After roughly 3 weeks, Suleiman withdrew. Vienna would mark the empire's deepest penetration into Central Europe, a high water line that subsequent sultans would attempt to reach again, but never surpass. Yet military conquest was only one dimension of Suleiman's reign. Europeans called him the Magnificent. His own subjects knew him as Kanuni, the lawgiver. Working with his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, and later with the brilliant jurist Ebu Suud Effendi, Suleiman codified Ottoman secular law into a comprehensive system that harmonized sultanic decree with Islamic jurisprudence. These legal codes governed taxation, land tenure, criminal punishment, and the rights of subjects across an empire of staggering diversity. The system did not replace Sharia but ran alongside it, creating a dual legal framework of remarkable sophistication. Istanbul itself became a monument to this ambition. The architect Sinan, perhaps the greatest builder the Islamic world ever produced, transformed the capital's skyline. The Suleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557, rose above the Golden Horn as a statement of imperial theology rendered in stone, lead, and light. Sinan designed hundreds of structures across the empire, from bridges in Bosnia to bathhouses in Damascus, creating an architectural language that unified Ottoman territories visually, as law unified them administratively. The empire's naval power reached its zenith under the Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, whose fleets dominated the Mediterranean from Algiers to the Aegean. Ottoman sea power projected force across North Africa, raided Italian and Spanish coasts, and contested Habsburg naval supremacy in a struggle that would define Mediterranean politics for decades. Suleiman's personal life carried its own weight of consequence. His relationship with Hürrem Sultan, the former slave who became his legal wife, broke Ottoman precedent and reshaped palace politics. Her influence extended into diplomacy and succession, and the execution of his eldest son, Mustafa, in 1553, driven partly by factional rivalry within the imperial household, cast a shadow over the reign's final years. Suleiman died in 1566 during the siege of Szigetvar in Hungary, campaigning to the last. His death was concealed from the army until the fortress fell. He had reigned 46 years, longer than any Ottoman sultan before him, and he left an empire at its absolute territorial, legal, and cultural peak. The institutions he refined would govern millions for centuries. The borders he established would define Ottoman strategic reality for generations. The world he built was magnificent, and it was complete. What followed would be the long, slow question of whether completeness was the same as permanence. Whether completeness was the same as permanence remained a question for the future. But in the decades surrounding Suleiman's reign, the city he adorned offered its own answer in the rhythm of daily life, a rhythm so intricate and self-sustaining that it seemed to exist outside the reach of time itself. 16th century Istanbul was the largest city in Europe and Western Asia, home to perhaps 400,000 souls by mid-century. It sprawled across its peninsula and spilled over the Golden Horn into Galata, climbed the hills of Üsküdar on the Asian shore, and pressed outward along the Marmara coast. Every morning, the call to prayer rippled across the skyline from hundreds of minarets, layering sound upon sound until the entire city vibrated with a single, sustained note. Then the streets filled. The Grand Bazaar sat at the commercial heart, a roofed labyrinth of over 3,000 shops organized by trade. Jewelers occupied one lane, leatherworkers another, silk merchants a third. Each guild operated under strict regulation, its prices monitored by market inspectors called muhtasibs, who checked weights, quality, and fair dealing. A carpet seller could not encroach on a spice merchant's territory. A baker who adulterated flour faced public punishment. The system was not merely commercial but moral, rooted in Islamic market ethics and enforced with genuine rigor. Beyond the bazaar, the city organized itself into neighborhoods called mahalles, each centered on a mosque or church or synagogue. A mahalla was a unit of collective responsibility. Its residents answered for one another's conduct, reported strangers, maintained order. Greek Orthodox families lived in the Fenner district along the Golden Horn. Jewish communities, many descended from those expelled from Spain in 1492, concentrated in Balat and Haskoy. Armenian merchants and craftsmen clustered near their churches. Muslim neighborhoods surrounded the great imperial mosque complexes. These groups were not sealed from one another. They traded daily, shared waterfront space, frequented the same hammams on different days, and navigated the same narrow streets where donkeys carried goods and water sellers called out their wares. The mosque complexes themselves were small cities. The Suleimania, completed in 1557, contained not only the mosque but a hospital, a soup kitchen feeding the poor, a caravanserai for travelers, a school of medicine, theological colleges, and a bathhouse. These foundations, called kulia, provided the empire's social infrastructure. They were funded by pious endowments, vakufs, whose income from rents and agricultural lands sustained charitable services for centuries. Along the waterfront, caiques darted between the three shores of the city. Fishermen hauled nets near the Galata Bridge. Foreign merchants from Venice, Genoa, Ragusa, and France maintained trading houses in Galata under capitulation agreements that granted them legal privileges. The district had a distinctly cosmopolitan atmosphere, its taverns and wine shops tolerated in ways that would have been impossible on the peninsula proper. And then there were the coffee houses, which appeared in Istanbul around 1555 and multiplied with astonishing speed. They became gathering places for poets, merchants, off-duty soldiers, and idlers. Men sat on low cushions, sipped from small cups, smoked tobacco when it arrived later in the century, and discussed politics, poetry, and commerce. The authorities regarded coffee houses with suspicion precisely because they fostered conversation beyond the control of mosque or guild. Periodic attempts to shut them down invariably failed. The coffee house had become indispensable. This was a city of extraordinary sensory density. The smell of roasting chestnuts mixed with incense drifting from a church doorway. The clatter of coppersmith hammers competed with the muezzin's voice. Tulips bloomed in palace gardens, while stray dogs patrolled the alleys. Istanbul, in its golden century, was not merely an imperial capital administered from above. It was a living organism, self-regulating, diverse, noisy, devout, commercial, and deeply human, sustained by institutions that turned the empire's grand ambitions into the texture of ordinary existence. Behind those streets and bazaars, behind the noise of commerce and prayer, stood a walled world unto itself. Topkapi Palace was not a single building, but a sequence of courtyards, each more restricted than the last, each guarding deeper layers of imperial power. To pass through its gates was to move from the public empire into its private heart, where decisions shaping 3 continents were made in whispered consultations, where fortunes rose and fell on the inclination of a single glance. The first courtyard was almost civic. Soldiers mustered there, petitioners waited. The imperial mint operated within earshot of the palace kitchens, which at their peak fed thousands daily. But the gate of salutation marked the true boundary. Beyond it, silence was enforced. No one spoke above a murmur. The second courtyard housed the imperial council, the divan, where the Grand Vizier and senior officials deliberated beneath a latticed window. The Sultan could listen unseen from above, his presence felt but never confirmed, a deliberate architecture of surveillance that kept even the most powerful ministers uncertain of when they were being observed. Deeper still lay the third courtyard, the Enderun, the inner palace school where boys gathered through the Devshirme system were educated for decades. They studied languages, calligraphy, theology, horsemanship, and music. The most gifted rose to become imperial pages attending the Sultan's person, handling his wardrobe, guarding his treasury, serving his meals. This was no mere household service. It was the empire's most rigorous meritocracy, producing future governors and grand viziers from converted Christian peasant sons who entered the palace as children and emerged as the Ottoman elite. The treasury they guarded held objects of staggering accumulation: jeweled daggers, emerald-encrusted thrones, relics believed to belong to the Prophet, porcelain collections numbering in the thousands. Each object represented not merely wealth, but diplomatic exchange, military victory, or dynastic inheritance. The treasury was the empire's material memory. But the most politically consequential space lay beyond even the Enderun. The harem, from the Arabic word for sanctuary, housed the Sultan's mother, his consorts, his children, and hundreds of attendants. Western imagination reduced it to sensuality. The reality was a sophisticated political institution. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, held formal authority over the harem and often wielded influence exceeding that of the Grand Vizier. During the period historians call the Sultanate of Women, spanning much of the 16th and 17th centuries, figures like Hürrem Sultan and Kösem Sultan shaped imperial policy, brokered alliances, commissioned monumental architecture, and determined succession. The harem's physical structure mirrored its hierarchies. The Valide Sultan occupied the grandest apartments. Favored consorts had private chambers decorated with Iznik tiles in turquoise and cobalt. Lower-ranking women shared dormitories. Enslaved women entered through purchase or capture, but the system offered pathways to extraordinary power. A woman who bore a son to the Sultan could become Haseki, a favored consort with her own income and political network. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Agassi, administered the harem and controlled access to the Sultan, making him one of the three most powerful officials in the empire. Court ceremonies reinforced the Sultan's sacred remoteness. Accession involved girding the sword of Osman at Eyüp, linking each new ruler to the dynasty's mythic founder. Bayram celebrations saw the Sultan receive obeisance in the throne room, seated on a gold-canopied dais, while officials approached in strict hierarchical order. Foreign ambassadors described the overwhelming silence, the rigid protocol, the sense that they stood before not merely a king, but a cosmic order made visible. Topkapi was thus less a residence than a machine for producing sovereignty. Every courtyard filtered access. Every ritual reinforced distance. Every institution within its walls, from the page school to the harem to the treasury, served the central fiction upon which Ottoman power depended: that the Sultan was both intimately connected to his empire and utterly apart from it, governing through systems designed to make his will appear inevitable rather than arbitrary. That will appeared inevitable because it was enforced by the most disciplined military apparatus in the medieval and early modern world. The Ottoman war machine was not a single army, but an interlocking system of recruitment, training, land tenure, naval power, and frontier fortification that, at its height, could project force simultaneously across the Danube, the Mediterranean, and the Persian frontier. At its core stood the Janissaries. Born from the Devshirme levy, Christian boys taken from Balkan villages every few years, These children were converted to Islam, subjected to rigorous physical and ideological training, and forged into an infantry corps whose loyalty belonged to the Sultan alone. They owned no land, married late if at all, and lived in barracks where the communal cooking pot became their sacred symbol. Their training grounds in Istanbul and Edirne produced soldiers who could march in disciplined formation, fire arquebuses in coordinated volleys, and hold defensive positions with a patience that stunned European opponents accustomed to cavalry charges and feudal levies. By the mid-15th century, the Janissary Corps numbered perhaps 10,000. Under Suleiman, it swelled to perhaps 30,000, and its members served not only as soldiers but as palace guards, provincial garrison troops, and enforcers of imperial order. Yet the Janissaries were only one element. The Sipahi cavalry formed the empire's territorial backbone. These mounted warriors held Taimar grants, parcels of agricultural land whose tax revenue supported the Sipahi in exchange for military service. When the Sultan called, each Sipahi rode to war equipped at his own expense, often bringing armed retainers proportional to his income. This system tied military obligation directly to land, ensuring that the empire's provinces were simultaneously governed and garrisoned without draining the central treasury. Tens of thousands of Sipahis could be mobilized across Anatolia and the Balkans, forming the heavy cavalry wings that flanked Janissary infantry in pitched battle. The Ottoman military genius lay in combining these forces with devastating artillery. Ottoman founders had recognized gunpowder's potential earlier than most rivals. By the siege of Constantinople, massive bombards cast by Hungarian and Ottoman engineers shattered walls that had stood for 1,000 years. In subsequent decades, Ottoman cannon foundries produced standardized field pieces that accompanied armies on campaign, giving them siege capability that no Balkan fortress or Hungarian castle could long resist. On water, the empire built fleets that dominated the eastern Mediterranean for over a century. The imperial arsenal at Galata, and later the vast shipyards at Qasim Pasha along the Golden Horn, could produce galleys at astonishing speed. Ottoman naval power secured grain shipments from Egypt, protected pilgrimage routes, and contested control of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa transformed the navy from a coastal defense force into a strategic instrument capable of raiding Italy, besieging Malta, and controlling North African ports. Binding this system together was a network of fortifications stretching from Belgrade along the Danube to Buda, from the Crimean coast to the fortresses guarding Mesopotamian river crossings. Each stronghold served as supply depot, garrison post, and administrative center, allowing Ottoman armies to campaign deep into enemy territory, while maintaining secure lines of communication. Road stations and bridges ensured that armies moved with a logistical efficiency that European states would not match for generations. The system's greatest strength was also its vulnerability. The Timar structure depended on continuous expansion to reward new Sipahis. The Janissary Corps depended on strict discipline and isolation from civilian life. When frontiers hardened and new land grew scarce, when Janissaries began marrying, entering trade, and enrolling their own sons rather than relying on the devshirme, the machinery that had conquered southeastern Europe and the Arab world began grinding against itself. But for nearly 3 centuries, this combination of slave soldiers, feudal cavalry, gunpowder artillery, naval fleets, and fortress chains created a military system of extraordinary reach, one that made the Sultan's will not merely visible within palace walls, but felt across 3 continents. That military reach extended across lands of extraordinary religious diversity, and the empire's longevity depended not only on the sword, but on a system of governance that managed difference rather than erasing it. The Ottoman state ruled over Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian Apostolics, Syriac Christians, Maronites, Catholics, Jews of multiple traditions, Sunni and Shia Muslims, and dozens of Sufi orders. Governing this mosaic required something more subtle than force. It required a framework, and the Ottomans built one that would endure for centuries. The millet system, as it came to be understood, organized non-Muslim communities into semi-autonomous bodies defined by religious affiliation rather than ethnicity or language. Each millet governed its own internal affairs. Marriage, divorce, inheritance, education, and religious practice fell under the jurisdiction of communal leaders answerable to the Sultan's government. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul presided over the largest Christian millet, exercising authority that extended from the Balkans to the Aegean Islands to Anatolian villages. His jurisdiction covered not only Greeks, but also Slavic, Romanian, and Arabic-speaking Orthodox Christians, binding them under a single ecclesiastical umbrella, regardless of mother tongue. The Armenian Patriarchate administered its own millet from Istanbul, overseeing communities scattered across eastern Anatolia, Cilicia, and the capital itself. Armenian merchants became vital intermediaries in Ottoman commerce, their network stretching from Isfahan to Amsterdam. Armenian churches, with their distinctive stone architecture and ancient liturgical traditions, stood in Ottoman cities as visible markers of a tolerated and self-governing community. Jewish communities held a particularly notable place. After the expulsion from Spain in 1492, tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews found refuge in Ottoman lands. Sultan Bayezid II reportedly welcomed them, recognizing the economic and intellectual capital they carried. Thessaloniki became a predominantly Jewish city. Istanbul's Balat neighborhood hummed with Hebrew printing presses, synagogues, and rabbinical academies. Jewish physicians served in the imperial court. The Ottoman state offered these communities not equality in the modern sense, but a structured coexistence that, by the standards of 15th and 16th century Europe, was remarkably tolerant. Non-Muslims paid the jizya, a poll tax that marked their subordinate but protected status as dhimmis. They could not bear arms, could not build new houses of worship without permission, and faced restrictions on dress and public display of religious symbols. These constraints were real, sometimes humiliating, and unevenly enforced depending on the era and the local governor. Yet within their communities, religious minorities maintained courts, schools, hospitals, and charitable foundations with considerable autonomy. Sufi orders wove through this fabric in ways that defied neat categorization. The Mevlevi dervishes of Konya, the Bektashi order closely linked to the Janissary corps, the Naqshbandi brotherhoods of the eastern provinces. These mystical communities operated across ethnic and sometimes even confessional lines. Tekkas served as lodges, hospices, and centers of spiritual instruction. Their rituals of chanting, movement, and meditation drew followers from all social classes, and their sheikhs often wielded influence that rivaled that of the official ulama. The system was neither paradise nor prison. It preserved difference by institutionalizing it. granting communities survival at the cost of permanent legal inequality. It prevented the kind of religious warfare that devastated early modern Europe, but it also embedded hierarchies that would generate bitter resentment when nationalist ideas arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Armenians would eventually reject the Millet framework, not because it had failed entirely, but because it could not accommodate the demand for sovereign equality. For centuries, though, the arrangement held. In the streets of Istanbul, church bells and the call to prayer sounded across the same neighborhoods. In Thessaloniki, Saturday Sabbath and Friday prayers marked the rhythm of adjacent quarters. In Aleppo and Damascus, ancient Christian communities maintained liturgies older than Islam itself, their existence protected by imperial decree. The Ottoman genius was not in eliminating difference, but in administering it, creating a political order capacious enough to contain faiths that elsewhere tore kingdoms apart. But that capacious order, so resilient in its prime, began to strain almost the moment Suleiman's coffin was carried from the Hungarian frontier. The century and a half that followed his death in 1566 was not a sudden collapse, but something more insidious, a slow erosion of institutional discipline, military supremacy, and fiscal coherence that transformed the empire from an expanding conqueror into a defensive power struggling to hold what it already possessed. The trouble began at the center. Selim II, Suleiman's surviving son, was the first sultan in generations to ascend without meaningful military experience. The tradition of princes governing provinces, learning statecraft through direct administration, withered. Subsequent sultans increasingly remained within the walls of Topkapi, their education confined to the harem, their authority mediated by viziers, eunuchs, and the Valid Sultan. The throne did not lack occupants, it lacked rulers forged by the demands of governance. Meanwhile, the Janissary corps, once the empire's sharpest instrument, corroded from within. Soldiers demanded the right to marry, to engage in trade, to enroll their sons outside the Devshirme system. By the early 17th century, the corps had swollen into an urban interest group, more concerned with protecting commercial privileges than maintaining battlefield readiness. Provincial sipahis, their Taimar revenues undermined by inflation and currency debasement, proved equally unreliable. The military machine that had terrified Europe now creaked under its own weight. Fiscally, the empire hemorrhaged. New World silver flooding through European trade networks destabilized Ottoman currency. Tax farming replaced direct collection, enriching intermediaries while impoverishing the treasury. Anatolian peasants, crushed between rising taxes and declining security, erupted in the Salali revolts that devastated the countryside for decades after 1590. Entire villages emptied. Agricultural production collapsed in regions that had fed imperial armies for generations. Yet the empire did not simply decay. In 1656, the appointment of Köprülü Mehmed Pasha as Grand Vizier inaugurated a remarkable family dynasty of administrators who temporarily reversed the decline. Köprülü Mehmed ruled with ruthless efficiency, purging corrupt officials, restoring fiscal discipline, and reasserting central authority over rebellious provinces. His son, Köprülü Fazıl Ahmed, continued the restoration, recapturing Crete from Venice after a siege lasting over 2 decades and stabilizing the Balkan frontier. For a generation, the Köprülü Grand Viziers demonstrated that Ottoman institutions, properly commanded, still possessed formidable capacity. This renewed confidence produced the empire's final great gamble. In 1683, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led an enormous army to the walls of Vienna, seeking the prize that had eluded Suleiman himself. For 2 months, Ottoman forces besieged the Habsburg capital. Mines were dug beneath fortifications. The garrison inside starved. Europe watched with dread. Then, on the 12th of September, a relief army led by the Polish King Jan Sobieski descended from the Kahlenberg Heights and shattered the Ottoman siege. The defeat was catastrophic, not merely in lives and materiel, but in psychological consequence. For the first time, European powers sensed that the Ottoman tide could be permanently reversed. What followed was a coordinated assault unlike anything the empire had faced. The Holy League, uniting Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, pressed on every front simultaneously. Hungary, Ottoman for 150 years, fell to Habsburg armies. The Morea passed to Venice. Azov fell to Russian forces. Fortress after fortress, province after province, slipped from Ottoman control in a cascade of military disasters. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized the reckoning. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire signed a peace treaty as the defeated party, ceding vast territories across multiple fronts. Hungary, Transylvania, Podolia, and the Morea passed to Christian powers. The treaty did not merely redraw borders. It announced a new geopolitical reality. The empire was no longer expanding. It was contracting, and the powers surrounding it had learned to coordinate their pressure. The long 17th century thus closed with the empire still vast, still governing millions across 3 continents, but fundamentally altered in its relationship to the world. The question was no longer how far Ottoman power could reach. It was whether the structures Osman's descendants had built could adapt fast enough to survive in a world where European states were growing stronger with every passing decade. The answer came slowly, and it came dressed in silk. In the decades following the Treaty of Karlowitz, the Ottoman state did not collapse. It turned inward. The empire that had defined itself through conquest now faced the unfamiliar task of defining itself through preservation, and the ruling elite began, cautiously, to look westward not for territory but for ideas. The reign of Ahmed III, beginning in 1703, marked a pivotal shift. After the deposition of Mustafa II in a Janissary-backed revolt, Ahmed ascended, knowing that raw military ambition had become ruinous. His Grand Vizier, Nevshehirli Ibrahim Pasha, pursued diplomacy over war, signing treaties, exchanging ambassadors, and studying European courts with genuine curiosity. Ottoman envoys traveled to Paris and Vienna, returning with descriptions of gardens, palaces, printing houses, and scientific instruments. For the first time, the empire sought not to conquer Europe, but to understand it. The result was the Tulip Era, a period of roughly 13 years during which Istanbul's elite cultivated an aesthetic revolution. Tulip gardens lined the shores of the Golden Horn. Nighttime festivals illuminated palace grounds with thousands of lamps nestled among blossoms. Pleasure pavilions rose along the Bosphorus. Poetry flourished. Miniature painting absorbed new perspectives. The court embraced refinement as a form of statecraft, projecting stability through beauty. Yet the most consequential innovation was quieter. In 1727, Ibrahim Mutafarika, a Hungarian-born convert, received permission to establish the empire's first printing press using movable Arabic type. Religious texts were excluded to appease the scholarly establishment, but works on geography, history, navigation, and language rolled off the press. It was a modest beginning, producing only 17 titles before the press fell dormant, but it cracked open a door that could never fully close again. The Tulip era ended violently. In 1730, a Janissary-backed rebellion led by Patrona Halil overthrew Ibrahim Pasha and forced Ahmed III to abdicate. The rebels denounced the court's extravagance while ordinary subjects suffered from inflation and military humiliation. The episode revealed a pattern that would haunt Ottoman reform for the next century. Every attempt at transformation provoked a conservative backlash rooted in Janissary power, religious traditionalism, and popular resentment of elite privilege. The middle decades of the 18th century saw fitful efforts at military modernization. Sultan Mahmud I and his successors invited European engineers to redesign fortifications and artillery schools. A French officer, the Baron de Tott, helped establish new training facilities in the 1770s. But these reforms remained superficial, grafted onto institutions that resisted structural change. The Janissaries, once the empire's finest soldiers, had become a hereditary urban militia more interested in protecting commercial privileges than in battlefield discipline. Provincial power, meanwhile, fragmented. In Egypt, Mamluk beys governed with near independence. In the Balkans, local notables called ayans accumulated land and military force, becoming regional strongmen who negotiated with Istanbul rather than obeying it. In Arabia, the Wahhabi movement challenged Ottoman religious authority itself. The empire's center held, but its grip on the periphery loosened with each decade. Selim III, ascending in 1789, attempted the most ambitious reforms yet. His Nizam-e-Tadid, or New Order, created a European-style army trained by foreign officers, funded by new taxes, and deliberately separated from Janissary control. The new troops drilled in modern formations, wore distinct uniforms, and represented a direct threat to the old military establishment. Selim also restructured provincial governance and sought to reassert central authority over rebellious ayans. The Janissaries understood exactly what the new order meant for their future. In 1807, they revolted, deposed Selim, and placed Mustafa IV on the throne. The following year, a loyalist commander named Alemdar Mustafa Pasha marched on Istanbul to restore Selim, but arrived too late. Selim had been murdered. Alemdar placed Mahmud II on the throne instead, but was himself killed in a subsequent Janissary uprising within months. By 1808, the empire had spent a century attempting to modernize while trapped by the very institutions that had once made it great. The Janissaries blocked military reform. Religious conservatives resisted cultural change. Provincial lords defied central authority. And European powers, growing ever stronger through industrialization and colonial expansion, pressed against Ottoman borders with increasing confidence. The question of survival had not been answered. It had only grown more urgent. Mahmud II inherited a throne besieged from every direction, and he understood with cold clarity that the empire could not survive without radical surgery. But he was patient. For nearly 2 decades after his accession in 1808, he watched, planned, and quietly built alliances among reformist officials and loyal military units, while the Janissaries continued to believe themselves untouchable. He studied the fate of Selim III and resolved not to repeat his predecessor's fatal mistake of announcing reform before possessing the power to enforce it. The moment came in June of 1826. Mahmud established a new European-style military corps and issued a decree requiring Janissary units to adopt modern training. The Janissaries revolted, as they had so many times before, overturning their soup kettles in the traditional signal of mutiny. This time, the Sultan was ready. Loyal artillery units surrounded the Janissary barracks in Istanbul and opened fire. Thousands perished in the bombardment and the street fighting that followed. The Janissary order, nearly 5 centuries old, was abolished in a single bloody afternoon that Ottoman historians would call the auspicious incident. Provincial Janissary garrisons were dissolved in the weeks that followed. The Bektashi Sufi order, long intertwined with Janissary identity, was suppressed. With the military obstacle removed, Mahmud launched reforms touching every dimension of Ottoman life. He replaced traditional robes and turbans with the fez and European-cut coats, a symbolic assault on the old visual order. He established a postal system, a government newspaper, medical and military academies modeled on French institutions, and a restructured provincial administration designed to reassert central control over distant governors. The hereditary power of the Anatolian derebes and the semi-independent pashas of Egypt, Albania, and Arabia was challenged with varying success. Muhammad Ali of Egypt proved the most dangerous, defeating Ottoman armies and nearly marching on Istanbul itself before European intervention checked his advance. Mahmud died in 1839, just days before the proclamation that would define the next era of Ottoman governance. His son Abdülmecid I, only 16 years old, presided over the reading of the Gülhane Edict in November of that year. Drafted largely by the reformist foreign minister Mustafa Reşid Pasha, the edict guaranteed the security of life, honor, and property for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. It promised fair taxation, regular military conscription, and public trials. The Tanzimat, meaning reorganization, had officially begun. Over the following decades, the empire remade its legal and administrative architecture with extraordinary ambition. New commercial codes drew on French law. A penal code replaced arbitrary punishment with codified sentences. Provincial administration was standardized through the Vilayet Law of 1867, dividing the empire into provinces governed by centrally appointed officials. Secular courts operated alongside religious ones. State schools expanded, teaching sciences and foreign languages alongside traditional Islamic education. The Land Code of 1858 attempted to regularize property ownership across the empire. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 brought the Ottomans into alliance with Britain and France against Russia, temporarily bolstering the empire's diplomatic standing and opening access to European capital markets. Ottoman bonds were sold on London and Paris exchanges, funding modernization but also beginning a cycle of foreign debt that would haunt the state for decades. Yet reform generated its own contradictions. The promise of equality for non-Muslims inflamed conservative Muslim opinion, while failing to satisfy Christian communities already drawn toward nationalism. Greece had already won independence. Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro pressed for autonomy. The very legal equality the Tanzimat proclaimed undermined the old millet system, without replacing it with a shared Ottoman identity strong enough to hold diverse populations together. By 1876, the empire had a new generation of reformers who believed that only a constitution and a parliament could save the state. The crisis of Balkan uprisings, European diplomatic pressure and fiscal collapse converged. Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed. His successor lasted months, and Abdulhamid II ascended the throne, promulgating the first Ottoman constitution in December of 1876. A parliament convened. For a brief moment, the empire appeared to be transforming itself into a constitutional monarchy. But the forces unleashed by reform, nationalism, debt, and great power rivalry were already pulling the empire apart faster than any institution could bind it together. Abdulhamid II suspended that constitution within 2 years. The parliament he had convened in 1877 was dissolved in 1878, and it would not reconvene for 3 decades. The Sultan retreated behind the walls of Yildiz Palace, a sprawling compound on the hills above the Bosphorus, and from there he governed the empire through a web of personal informants, telegraph lines, censorship bureaus, and secret police. This was not the reform the Tanzimat architects had envisioned. It was autocracy refined by modern technology. The immediate catalyst was war. Russia invaded in 1877, smashing through Ottoman defenses in both the Balkans and the Caucasus. The Treaty of San Stefano, imposed in 1878, threatened to create a vast Bulgarian state under Russian influence, effectively ending Ottoman power in southeastern Europe. Only the intervention of the great powers at the Congress of Berlin that same summer preserved fragments of Ottoman sovereignty. But the price was staggering. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro gained full independence. Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia and Herzegovina. Britain took Cyprus. Bulgaria became an autonomous principality. The empire hemorrhaged territory, and with it, millions of Muslim refugees flooded into Anatolia and the remaining Ottoman provinces, their displacement reshaping the demographic fabric of the state. Abdulhamid drew a bitter lesson from this catastrophe. He concluded that liberalism and parliamentary debate had weakened the empire at its moment of greatest peril. His response was centralized control, pan-Islamic ideology, and the cultivation of the caliphal title as a tool of legitimacy among Muslims worldwide. He built the Hejaz Railway to connect Damascus to Medina, funded mosques and schools across the Islamic world, and positioned himself as the defender of the faith against Christian imperial encroachment. Domestically, he expanded education, built telegraph networks, established police academies, and modernized infrastructure, all while suppressing political dissent with ruthless efficiency. Yet the forces of nationalism that Berlin had unleashed could not be contained by surveillance alone. In the Balkans, Bulgarian unification in 1885, Cretan uprisings, and Macedonian revolutionary committees kept the region in perpetual crisis. Each revolt invited European diplomatic intervention, and each intervention diminished Ottoman sovereignty further. The empire became the object of great power management rather than an actor in its own right, earning the epithet that would define its final decades. In the eastern provinces, tensions between Armenian communities and the Ottoman state erupted into devastating violence. Armenian political organizations demanded reforms guaranteed by the Berlin Treaty, but never implemented. Between 1894 and 1896, massacres swept through Anatolia, killing tens of thousands of Armenians. European powers protested, but did not intervene with force. The killings deepened communal divisions and signaled to the world that the Ottoman state was losing its capacity to govern its own populations without mass violence. Inside the empire, a generation educated in the very military and administrative schools Abdul Hamid had expanded began to turn against him. Young officers and intellectuals, many stationed in Balkan garrisons where they witnessed territorial disintegration firsthand, formed secret cells. They read French political philosophy, debated constitutionalism, and concluded that only the restoration of parliamentary government could arrest the empire's collapse. These conspirators coalesced into the Committee of Union and Progress, operating from Salonika, the cosmopolitan port city that embodied everything the empire was losing. By 1908, the pressure was unbearable. Abdul Hamid had maintained order for 30 years through fear, faith, and infrastructure, but the empire was smaller, deeper in debt, and surrounded by predatory neighbors. The constitution he had buried in 1878 was about to be resurrected by the very soldiers he had trained to defend the state. The autocrat of Yildiz Palace had built the instruments of his own undoing. In July of 1908, the resurrection arrived not from Istanbul, but from the Macedonian garrisons. Officers of the Third Army Corps, loyal to the Committee of Union and Progress, marched from their barracks and demanded the restoration of the constitution. Abdul Hamid, calculating as ever, yielded within days. The 1876 constitution was proclaimed anew, and across the empire, scenes of extraordinary jubilation erupted. In Salonika, Muslims embraced Christians in the streets. In Istanbul, crowds wept before government buildings. In Beirut and Baghdad, newspapers printed freely for the first time in a generation. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the empire believed it had found the formula for survival: liberty, equality, fraternity under the Ottoman crescent. Elections followed that autumn, and the committee swept into parliament. But governing proved infinitely harder than conspiring. The new regime inherited every crisis Abdul Hamid had managed through autocracy: separatist movements, foreign debts, military weakness, and the relentless appetite of European powers. Within months, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bulgaria declared full independence. Crete announced union with Greece. The constitutional revolution, meant to strengthen the empire, had instead signaled vulnerability. In April of 1909, a counter-revolution erupted in Istanbul. Reactionary soldiers and religious conservatives briefly seized the capital, demanding the restoration of Islamic law and the end of constitutional rule. The committee responded with devastating efficiency. The Action Army marched from Salonika, crushed the uprising, and deposed Abdul Hamid himself. His brother Mehmed V ascended the throne as a constitutional figurehead, and real power passed decisively to the committee's inner circle. Yet the Committee of Union and Progress was not a monolith. It was a coalition of idealists, nationalists, and opportunists bound together by opposition to autocracy, but divided over the empire's future. Some championed Ottomanism, the dream of equal citizenship transcending religion and ethnicity. Others gravitated toward Turkism, a narrower identity that privileged the Turkish-speaking Muslim core. As Balkan provinces slipped away and Christian minorities proved increasingly drawn to their own national projects, the universalist vision withered. Power concentrated in the hands of a triumvirate: Enver, Talat, and Cemal, three men whose ambitions would carry the empire into catastrophe. The Italian invasion of Ottoman Libya in 1911 exposed the regime's military fragility. Tripoli fell with humiliating speed, and the empire lost its last African territory. Before that wound could heal, the Balkan Wars struck with devastating force. In October of 1912, Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece attacked simultaneously. Ottoman armies, stretched thin and poorly coordinated, collapsed across nearly every front. Edirne, the empire's former capital, fell to Bulgarian siege. Salonika, the birthplace of the revolution itself, was lost to Greece in a matter of weeks. Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, territories the Ottomans had held for 5 centuries, vanished from the map in months. The shock was existential. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees flooded into Anatolia and the rump of European Turkey, carrying stories of massacre and dispossession. The committee responded with a coup in January of 1913, seizing direct control of the government. Enver, now war minister, recaptured Edirne during the Second Balkan War when the victors turned on each other, but the larger losses were irreversible. The empire that had once besieged Vienna now clung to a sliver of European soil around Istanbul. Desperate for a great power ally, the committee turned to Germany. The Kaiser's empire offered military advisors, modern weapons, and the promise of protection against Russia, the ancient enemy pressing from the Caucasus and the Black Sea. German officers reorganized Ottoman divisions. A German military mission under Lehmann von Sanders took command of training programs. 2 German warships, gifted to the Ottoman Navy, would soon alter the course of history. By the summer of 1914, the Ottoman Empire stood at the edge of a precipice it had spent 6 years trying to escape. The constitutional experiment had not halted territorial collapse. Reform had not outpaced disintegration. The triumvirate, young and reckless, believed that a great European war might offer the empire its last chance to recover lost lands and reassert imperial dignity. When the guns of August shattered the European peace, the Ottomans were already leaning toward the abyss. The abyss swallowed them in November of 1914. The Ottoman Empire entered the war not with a formal declaration, but with a naval bombardment of Russian Black Sea ports, carried out by those German-gifted warships flying the Ottoman crescent. Within days, Russia, Britain, and France declared war on the empire. The triumvirate had made their gamble. Now the empire would fight on fronts stretching from the frozen Caucasus Mountains to the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, from the narrow straits of the Dardanelles to the ancient sands of Sinai. The Caucasus front opened in catastrophe. Enver Pasha, the war minister, personally commanded a winter offensive against Russian positions in December of 1914. He drove nearly 100,000 men into the mountains around Sarikamish in freezing conditions without adequate supplies, winter clothing, or coherent strategy. The result was annihilation. Tens of thousands froze to death or fell to Russian counterattacks. Fewer than a fifth returned. The disaster shattered Ottoman strength in the east and unleashed a chain of consequences that would stain the empire's final years with irredeemable horror. In the spring of 1915, the Ottoman government, blaming Armenian communities for collaborating with Russian forces, ordered mass deportations of Armenians from eastern Anatolia. What followed was systematic destruction. Entire populations were marched into the Syrian desert without food or water. Men were separated and killed. Women and children perished on roads that became corridors of death. Estimates of the dead range from 600,000 to over 1 million. The events constitute one of the 20th century's first great crimes against a civilian population, a wound that remains unhealed and fiercely contested to this day. That same spring, the Dardanelles erupted. Britain and France, seeking to knock the Ottoman Empire from the war and open a supply route to Russia, launched a naval assault on the straits in March of 1915. When the warships failed, ground forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in April. What followed were 8 months of brutal trench warfare on narrow coastal ridges. Ottoman defenders, commanded in part by Mustafa Kemal, held their positions with extraordinary tenacity. The Allied forces, pinned on exposed beaches, suffered devastating casualties. By January of 1916, the invaders evacuated. Gallipoli became a defining Ottoman victory and forged the legend of a young commander whose name the world would soon know. But victory at Gallipoli could not compensate for collapse elsewhere. In Mesopotamia, British forces advanced up the Tigris and Euphrates, suffering their own disaster at Kut in 1916 before eventually capturing Baghdad in 1917. In Arabia, Sharif Hussein of Mecca launched a revolt against Ottoman rule in June of 1916, encouraged by British promises of an independent Arab state. Arab irregular forces, aided by British liaison officers, struck Ottoman garrisons and severed the Hejaz railway. Province by province, the Arab lands slipped away. In Palestine, British forces under General Allenby broke through Ottoman lines and entered Jerusalem in December of 1917, walking through the Jaffa Gate on foot. By the autumn of 1918, Allenby's armies shattered the remaining Ottoman forces at Megiddo and swept northward into Syria. Damascus fell in October. The empire was hemorrhaging from every wound. Famine ravaged Syria and Lebanon. Desertion hollowed the armies. The population, already diminished by years of war and deportation, endured epidemics and starvation. The infrastructure that had sustained 6 centuries of governance was collapsing under the weight of total war, fought on too many fronts with too few resources. On the 30th of October, 1918, Ottoman representatives signed the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship. The empire ceased fighting. Allied warships sailed into the straits. Foreign soldiers occupied the capital. The Sultan remained on his throne, but the throne now stood in a conquered city. 6 centuries of sovereignty had been shattered in 4 years of war, and the empire that had once made Europe tremble lay prostrate, awaiting partition by the very powers it had sought to defy. The occupation began before the ink on the armistice had dried. British, French, and Italian forces moved into Istanbul in stages, their warships anchoring along the Bosphorus, their soldiers patrolling streets that had served as the seat of an empire for nearly 5 centuries. By March of 1920, the occupation became formal. Allied troops seized government buildings, arrested nationalist politicians, and dissolved the Ottoman parliament. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, remained in Yıldız Palace, but his authority extended no further than the shadow of Allied bayonets. He cooperated with the occupiers, believing survival required submission. But it was the Greek landing at Smyrna on the 15th of May, 1919, that ignited the fire no armistice could contain. Greek soldiers marched through the waterfront under Allied approval, and within hours violence erupted against the Turkish population. The occupation of Western Anatolia was intended to enforce the peace, yet it achieved the opposite. Across the interior, former Ottoman officers, disbanded soldiers, and local militias began organizing resistance. The empire was dying, but the land itself refused to be partitioned without a fight. Into this chaos stepped Mustafa Kemal. dispatched to Samsun on the 19th of May, 1919, ostensibly to oversee demobilization, he instead began rallying opposition. The congresses at Erzurum and Sivas in the summer and autumn of that year produced a national pact declaring the territorial integrity of the Turkish-speaking heartland non-negotiable. Ankara, a modest Anatolian town far from occupied Istanbul, became the seat of a rival government. By April of 1920, a Grand National Assembly convened there, claiming sovereign authority over the Turkish nation. The war that followed was existential. Greek forces advanced deep into Anatolia, reaching the Sakarya River barely 50 miles from Ankara by the summer of 1921. The nationalist armies, poorly supplied and outnumbered, fought defensive battles of extraordinary desperation. The Battle of Sakarya lasted 22 days, and when the Greek advance finally halted, the strategic tide turned. For a full year the front stabilized while Kemal rebuilt his forces, secured supplies from Soviet Russia and nationalist sympathizers, and forged a disciplined army from the remnants of imperial collapse. The decisive blow came in August of 1922. The great offensive shattered Greek lines at Dumlupınar, and the nationalist advance became a rout. Within weeks, Turkish forces reached Smyrna, and the Greek army evacuated in catastrophe. The city burned in a conflagration whose origins remain bitterly disputed, and hundreds of thousands of civilians fled in scenes of devastating human suffering. With military victory secured, Kemal turned to the political architecture of the old order. On the 1st of November, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate, severing the 600-year bond between the Ottoman dynasty and sovereign power. Mehmed VI slipped out of Istanbul aboard a British warship, departing into exile without ceremony. The caliphate lingered briefly as a spiritual office, stripped of political authority, before its own abolition followed in 1924. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July of 1923, replaced the punitive Treaty of Sèvres that the Allies had imposed on the defeated empire. It recognized the sovereignty and borders of the new Turkish state, a rare instance of a defeated power renegotiating its peace terms through armed resistance. Population exchanges between Greece and Turkey uprooted over 1 million people on each side, redrawing the human geography of the eastern Mediterranean in a convulsion of forced migration. On the 29th of October, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was formally proclaimed, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. The Ottoman Empire, which had once commanded territories from Budapest to Basra, from Algiers to the Caucasus, ceased to exist not merely as a political entity, but as a concept of governance. The caliphate, the sultanate, the imperial court, the dynasty itself, all were dismantled with deliberate finality. What rose from the ashes was not a continuation, but a conscious rupture, a state built on the principle that the future demanded the burial of the imperial past. But burial does not mean disappearance. The Ottoman Empire dissolved as a political structure, yet its shadow stretches across 3 continents with a persistence that no treaty or revolution could erase. The borders of the modern Middle East, those straight lines and awkward angles that define Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel, were drawn not from the geography of nations, but from the administrative provinces of the Ottoman state. European diplomats at Versailles and San Remo carved mandates from what had been Ottoman vilayets, imposing boundaries that ignored tribal affiliations, sectarian distributions, and economic realities that Ottoman governors had spent centuries navigating. The consequences of those decisions continue to generate conflict a full century later. In the Balkans, the Ottoman withdrawal left behind a mosaic of peoples whose identities had been forged under centuries of imperial rule. Mosques still stand in Sarajevo, Skopje, and Plovdiv, their minarets rising beside Orthodox churches and Catholic cathedrals in arrangements that reflect the millet system's legacy of communal coexistence and communal separation alike. The wars that tore Yugoslavia apart in the 1990s carried echoes of Ottoman-era demographic patterns, and the national mythologies of Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania all define themselves partly through narratives of liberation from Ottoman dominion. The empire remains a living presence in Balkan memory, simultaneously mourned and condemned, depending on which community speaks. Modern Turkey itself maintains the most complex relationship with its Ottoman predecessor. Ataturk's republic deliberately severed institutional continuity, abolishing the caliphate, adopting the Latin alphabet, replacing Islamic law with secular codes, even changing the weekly day of rest. Yet Istanbul's skyline remains an Ottoman composition. The Suleymaniye and the Sultan Ahmed mosques define the city's silhouette. The Grand Bazaar still operates as a commercial labyrinth whose origins reach back to the 15th century. Turkish cuisine, music, and social customs carry Ottoman DNA in ways that no legislative reform could fully overwrite. In recent decades, a cultural and political reassessment has brought Ottoman heritage back into public discourse, with restoration projects, television dramas, and political rhetoric reclaiming the imperial past as a source of pride rather than embarrassment. The Ottoman architectural legacy alone constitutes one of the great built environments in human history. From the mosques of Sinan in Istanbul and Edirne to the bridges of Bosnia, the fountains of Damascus, the fortifications of Rhodes, and the caravanserais lining trade routes from Anatolia to Arabia, Ottoman construction shaped the physical world of an enormous geography. Calligraphy, tilework, and textile traditions developed under imperial patronage continue to inform artistic practice across the Islamic world. The empire's administrative innovations left equally durable marks. Ottoman land registration systems formed the basis for property law in successor states. The millet framework influenced how modern Middle Eastern and Balkan states conceptualized minority governance. Even the coffee house, that quintessential institution of European intellectual life, traces its origins to Ottoman social culture, spreading from Istanbul to Vienna to Paris during the centuries of contact and conflict. 6 centuries of Ottoman rule produced no single legacy, but many, contradictory, contested, and deeply embedded in the structures of the modern world. The empire that began with a frontier chieftain's ambition in northwestern Anatolia ended by shaping the political geography, cultural landscape, and collective memory of dozens of nations. Its story is not merely one of rise and fall, but of transformation, of an imperial order that dissolved into the foundations of the world that replaced it, invisible yet inescapable, like the deep currents beneath a changed and restless sea. Thank you for journeying through 6 centuries of Ottoman history. If this series has deepened your understanding of the past, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss a new documentary when it arrives.